The soft vibration of my phone against the mahogany nightstand pulled me from restless sleep. The bedroom was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of Boston's early morning traffic filtering through our townhouse's historic windows. I reached for my phone, squinting as the harsh blue light illuminated the darkness. It was 2:18 a.m. Annual trust disbursement authorized. $4. $7 million transferred to holding account. The notification from my private banking app sat there, matter of fact and unassuming, much like I had been in my marriage for 15 years. I glanced at the empty space beside me where James should have been sleeping. His business trip to New York, or at least that's what he'd told me. The pristine, untouched pillow seemed to know secrets it wasn't sharing. I didn't bolt upright in shock. I didn't gasp or cry out. Instead, I felt an unusual clarity wash over me, as if I'd finally awakened from a decade-and-a-half slumber. The weight of the decision I'd made earlier that day, the series of calls to the trust board, the unanimous vote, the quiet signing of documents, settled comfortably around me like an old cashmere throw. 15 years of marriage crystallized in this single moment of absolute clarity. For so long, I had been living a divided life. Olivia Calloway, the principal trustee of one of Boston's oldest family fortunes by day, and Olivia Halstead, the supportive, ornamental wife of investment wunderkind James Halstead by night. The woman who managed billions in assets while simultaneously being told by her husband that she didn't need to worry her pretty head about complex money matters. I slid out of bed, my bare feet meeting the cool hardwood floors of our meticulously restored Beacon Hill townhouse. The silence felt different tonight, expectant, almost alive with possibility. I made my way to the window, looking out over the historic neighborhood with its gas lamps casting gentle pools of light on cobblestone streets. How many mornings had I stood at this very window, watching the financial district come alive in the distance, knowing my decisions would ripple through those gleaming towers while the man sleeping behind me remained blissfully unaware. The irony hadn't escaped me all these years. James prided himself on his financial acumen, his ability to read people and situations, to anticipate market shifts and investor psychology. Yet he had never once read me correctly. Never once looked past the carefully curated image of the perfect Boston Brahmin wife I presented to the world at his insistence. I wrapped my silk robe tighter around myself and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. Our housekeeper wouldn't arrive for hours, and the stillness of our home felt like a rare gift. I brewed a cup of Earl Grey, a small rebellion, as James insisted coffee was the only acceptable morning beverage for serious people, and carried it to my private study. This room, at least, was mine alone. James called it my hobby room and rarely entered. If he had, he might have noticed the hidden panel beside the antique secretary desk, concealing a state-of-the-art secure computer setup where I often conducted Calloway trust business. He might have questioned why his housewife needed a government grade, encrypted connection, and dual monitors. He might have wondered about the locked files in the mahogany cabinet that contained quarterly reports of his own company's performance, annotated in my handwriting. But James never looked closely at anything related to me, and that had been his most significant miscalculation. I settled into my leather chair and opened my laptop, the screen illuminating with the Calloway Trust dashboard. The transfer was complete, the funds now resting in our holding company rather than flowing into Halstead Partners, as they had quarterly for the past decade. By tomorrow afternoon, no, I corrected myself, by this afternoon, James would discover the funding gap. His carefully orchestrated business operations would hit their first significant obstacle in years. And for once, his charm, connections, and Harvard MBA wouldn't be enough to smooth things over. I took a sip of tea, allowing myself a moment to reflect on how we had arrived at this juncture. It hadn't been a single moment of revelation, but rather a slow accumulation of slights, dismissals, and condescension that had gradually crystallized into unignorable clarity last weekend at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, the Halstead Partners' 20th anniversary gala had been planned to perfection, with James squarely at the center of a narrative about visionary leadership and financial brilliance. I had played my assigned role flawlessly, the elegant, supportive wife in a custom Carolina Herrera gown, circulating among Boston's elite with practiced charm. I knew most of the city's power players far better than James realized, many of them having sat across from me in Callaway boardrooms or philanthropic committees. But that night, as always in public, I was simply James Halstead's wife, a beautiful accessory to his success story. I remembered now the specific weight of the diamond earrings I'd worn that night, family heirlooms worth more than James's, first year's salary, and how he'd approved them with a distracted nod, unaware of their history or value. Just as he remained unaware that the prestigious clients he'd spent months courting often already knew me through Boston's intricate network of old money and careful philanthropy. The memory of what I'd overheard at the gala threatened to surface, but I pushed it back down. There would be time enough to revisit that particular wound. For now, I needed to prepare for the day ahead, a day that would forever divide my life into before and after. I navigated through the secure server to review the timeline my team had prepared. By 9 a.m., Chen and Associates would deliver the formal notification to Halstead Partners headquarters regarding the trust's strategic realignment of investments. By 10 a.m., James's financial officer would be frantically trying to understand the implications for their quarterly operations. By noon, James himself would likely be calling an emergency meeting with his executive team. And by 3 p.m., if my calculations were correct, he would receive the request for his personal appearance at the Callaway Trust offices the following morning. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, with the precision I'd applied to financial strategies for 2 decades. The same methodical approach that had grown the Callaway fortune by 34% during my tenure as trustee would now be applied to dismantling the carefully constructed fiction that was my marriage. I closed the laptop and moved to the eastern window of my study, watching as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the Boston skyline. The city where generations of Callaways had built their legacy was waking up, unaware that one of its most celebrated financial partnerships was about to undergo a seismic shift. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. "Olivia, remember that money doesn't just open doors, it builds the entire house. Your responsibility is to ensure it's a house worth living in." For too long, I had allowed James to believe he was the architect of our success, the builder of our shared life. Today, I would remind him, and perhaps myself, who actually held the blueprint. I finished my tea as the sky transitioned from deep navy to pale lavender. In a few hours, James would call from New York, expecting his usual morning check-in with his adorably domestic wife. He would ask if I'd confirmed our dinner reservations with the Montgomerys for the following evening, remind me about the charity auction items he wanted me to bid on, perhaps mention which of his shirts needed attention from our dry cleaner. I would respond as I always had, with gentle affirmation and supportive efficiency. The perfect corporate wife, maintaining his perfect home life while he maintained our perfect image. His world would still appear intact during that call. He wouldn't yet know that the ground beneath his carefully constructed reality had already shifted. I showered and dressed with particular care, selecting a subtle Chanel suit that James had once described as making me look appropriately professional for the rare occasions he included me in business events. The irony wasn't lost on me as I applied my makeup with practiced precision. Today would certainly qualify as a business event, though not one James would have chosen to include me in. As I fastened my grandmother's pearls around my neck, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror above my vanity. At 42, I still maintained the polished appearance that had initially attracted James, the embodiment of old money Boston elegance that had complemented his ambitious new money drive. But looking closely now, I recognized something in my eyes that had been absent for years: purpose, determination. Perhaps even a hint of the fiery independence that had made me the youngest senior portfolio manager in Blackridge Capital's history before I'd set it aside to manage the Callaway Trust, before I'd met James, before I'd allowed myself to become, in his eyes and eventually in my own, just a housewife. My phone chimed with a text from Esther Chen. Documents delivered to courier. Will arrive at HP headquarters at 9 a.m. sharp. All systems go. Esther had been my grandfather's attorney before becoming mine, one of the few people who knew both sides of my life intimately. She had watched with silent concern as I gradually retreated from my public role in Boston's financial community after marrying James. She had never directly questioned my choices, but her careful documentation of every decision James's firm made with Callaway money spoke volumes about her foresight and perhaps her skepticism about the man I had chosen. Acknowledged, I texted back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'll be at your office by 11. Another text arrived, this one from my cousin Michael, who sat on the trust board with me. All board members briefed. Unanimous support confirmed. Operation Clarity proceeding. Michael had been more vocal than Esther about his concerns over the years, particularly as he observed James taking credit for investment strategies that had originated with Callaway advisors. He's building his reputation with your family's resources, Liv, he'd warned 5 years ago. Make sure he remembers that when the spotlight hits. James never had remembered, or perhaps he'd never known in the first place. The careful compartmentalization of our lives had been my choice initially, a desire to be loved for myself rather than my family's fortune. But over time, that separation had calcified into something more troubling. James's genuine belief in his own mythology as a self-made financial genius, with me as nothing more than an appropriate social accessory. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Winters, our housekeeper of 10 years, was already preparing James's favorite breakfast smoothie, a habit she maintained even when he traveled. "Good morning, Mrs. Halstead," she greeted me, with her usual warmth. "You're up and dressed early today. Special plans?" I smiled, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Yes, actually. I have some important business to attend to downtown. I may be gone most of the day." If she noticed anything unusual in this announcement, she didn't show it. After all, my charitable work often took me to meetings across the city. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that many of those charity committee meetings had actually been Callaway Trust business, conducted discreetly from private rooms in Boston's oldest financial institutions. "Very good, ma'am. And for dinner? Will Mr. Halstead be returning from New York this evening?" "No," I replied, surprised at how liberating the word felt. "He'll be staying in New York tonight, and I may be dining out as well. Please don't wait for me." I checked my watch, a subtle Patek Philippe that had been my father's, its value probably greater than the annual salary of most of James's employees. It was 7:30 a.m. In New York, James would be waking up in his suite at the Four Seasons, preparing for his meeting with potential investors. Investors who, unknown to him, had already received discreet calls from Callaway Associates regarding a strategic realignment in the trust's investment approach. My phone rang, right on schedule. James. "Good morning, darling," I answered, my voice carrying the warm, slightly deferential tone he'd grown accustomed to. "Morning, Liv." His voice had that brisk, energized quality it always carried before important meetings, the sound of a man confident in his complete control of his universe. "Just checking in. Everything set for the Montgomerys tomorrow night?" "Yes, I confirmed yesterday. 8 o'clock at L'Espalier." "Perfect. Did you remember to have my blue Thomas pink shirt pressed for tomorrow? The one with the subtle stripe?" "It's ready and waiting," I replied, marveling at how these mundane details could seem so important to a man who prided himself on managing billions in assets. Great. Listen, my first meeting got pushed up, so I've got to run. The Richardson pitch documents should be delivered this morning. Can you make sure they get put on my desk for when I'm back tomorrow? The Richardson pitch, another investment, opportunity that had come through Callaway connections, though James believed it had originated with his own network. Of course, I said, knowing those documents would be the least of his concerns by tomorrow. You're the best, Liv. This is why we work so well together. You handle the home front like a pro, and I handle the business. Perfect team. I closed my eyes, absorbing the casual compartmentalization that had defined our marriage. Perfect team, I echoed. All right, gotta run. Love you. Love you too, I responded automatically, disconnecting the call. For a moment, I stood motionless in our immaculate kitchen, the morning light streaming through leaded glass windows onto Italian marble countertops. The house that James believed he had provided, not knowing that the Callaway Trust had purchased it outright as a wedding gift. Another detail he'd never bothered to investigate beyond accepting it as his due. In the distance, I could hear the distinctive sound of a car pulling up outside our townhouse. A glance through the window confirmed it was the discreet black Lincoln sent by Chen and Associates. My transportation to the next chapter of my life. I gathered my Hermes handbag, a birthday gift from James who had selected it because all the partners' wives carry Hermes, and slipped my portfolio into it. As I prepared to leave, I hesitated in our grand entryway, taking in the portrait of James and me that hung prominently above the antique console. Taken at the Halstead Partners' 5th anniversary gala, it showed him in mid-gesture, explaining something important, while I gazed at him with perfect wifely admiration. The perfect corporate power couple. The brilliant investment strategist and his devoted, elegant wife. By this time tomorrow, that carefully crafted image would be irreparably altered. James would know that the financial acumen he prided himself on had missed the most significant detail of all, that his picture-perfect wife, the woman he dismissed as just a housewife, had been the actual power behind his throne all along. As I stepped out into the crisp Boston morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating lightness of authenticity. Today, Olivia Callaway would no longer be hiding in the shadow of Olivia Halstead. Today, I would reclaim not just my family name, but my true identity. The car door opened, and I slid into the plush leather seat. "Good morning, Ms. Callaway," the driver said, using my maiden name for the first time in 15 years. "To Chen and Associates, correct?" "Yes," I replied, feeling the weight of my decision settle comfortably around my shoulders like a familiar coat I'd set aside for too long. "I have some long overdue business to attend to." As the car pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at the townhouse that had been both my sanctuary and my prison. Instead, I focused on the Boston skyline ahead, where the morning sun glinted off the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere in one of those buildings, a courier was preparing to deliver documents that would shatter James's carefully constructed reality. The awakening had begun. The first time I noticed it was during a dinner party at the Whitcombs' estate in Manchester by the Sea, barely 6 months into our marriage. James and I were seated at opposite ends of the table, as was customary among our social circle. Eleanor Whitcomb, seated to my right, had asked about my transition from career woman to married life. "It must be quite an adjustment," she said, swirling her montrachet thoughtfully. "Going from managing portfolios at Blackridge to managing a household." Before I could answer, James's voice carried down the length of the mahogany table, cutting through multiple conversations with practiced ease. "Olivia's thriving in her new role," he announced, his smile confident and just a touch condescending. "She's finding charity work much more fulfilling than spreadsheets and market reports. Aren't you, darling?" All eyes turned to me, awaiting confirmation of this narrative I'd never actually shared with him. I remember the weight of that moment, the expectant silence, the slight tilt of James's head that suggested there was only one acceptable response. "It's certainly different," I replied diplomatically, my fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around the stem of my wine glass. James laughed, the sound polished and performative. She's being modest. Just last week, she organized a fundraiser that brought in 6 figures for the Children's Hospital. My wife has quite a talent for persuading Boston's elite to open their checkbooks. What James didn't mention, what he didn't know, was that those 6 figures had largely come from discreet calls I'd made to Callaway Associates, leveraging relationships built during my years in finance. The smile I offered in response to his praise felt stretched across my face, a social mask already becoming too familiar. Later that night, as our driver navigated back toward Boston, I attempted to address what had happened. James, about what? You said at dinner. You were wonderful tonight, he interrupted, his attention on his phone as he scrolled through emails. The Stevensons were very impressed. Carl mentioned he might move some of his foundation's assets to Halstead Partners. That's not what I... Oh, and remind me to send Eleanor a thank you note for the seating arrangement. Putting me next to Patricia Morgan was brilliant. Her family office is looking for new management, and I made significant inroads. I turned to look out the window at the coastline disappearing into darkness, swallowing the words I'd prepared. It was the first time I recognized a pattern that would define our marriage. My voice, systematically overwritten by his narrative. The signs continued to manifest in subtle ways during those early years. There was the joint Christmas card where James listed his title as founder and CEO, Halstead Partners, while I was simply Olivia. There were the dinner conversations with his colleagues where he would place his hand on mine whenever I began, discussing market trends, a gentle but firm indication that I should yield the floor. And then there was our 3rd anniversary dinner at L'Espalier, when I suggested investing some of our personal funds in an emerging tech company I'd been researching. That's sweet, Leave, he'd said, patting my hand affectionately. But why don't you leave the investment decisions to me? After all, it's what I do professionally. What he didn't know, what I chose not to mention, was that I had already directed the Callaway Trust to take a significant position in that same company. Within 18 months, the stock had tripled in value. When James later discovered the company and enthusiastically shared his find with me, I merely nodded and congratulated him on his insight. By our 5th anniversary, the pattern had solidified into an unspoken contract. James would build his reputation as a financial visionary, and I would maintain the infrastructure of our social life, the impeccable home, the strategic dinner parties, the carefully cultivated image of the perfect power couple. My opinions on finance, politics, or business strategy were welcome only insofar as they reflected and reinforced his own. The most telling sign came during the renovation of our Beacon Hill townhouse. I had established a private study for myself. On the 3rd floor, a sanctuary where I could conduct Callaway business away from James's awareness. Why do you need such a large space? He'd questioned, reviewing the architectural plans. Wouldn't you prefer to use this room as a proper ladies' sitting room? Something with more natural light for your book club meetings? I'd like a private space for my correspondence and charitable work, I'd explained. Something with substantial bookshelves and a proper desk. He'd studied me with mild amusement. Correspondence and charitable work. You make it sound so official. His tone softened as he wrapped an arm around my waist. All right, if it makes you happy. Though I still think you'd be more comfortable in a brighter space. What he didn't know was that I had already arranged for specialized wiring to be installed during the renovation, secure connections that would allow me to conduct confidential Callaway business without leaving home. The contractor had been paid directly by the trust, the invoices never crossing James's desk. The study became my sanctuary and command center, the place where I maintained my dual identity. There, behind a locked door that James rarely approached, I reviewed quarterly reports, authorized multi-million-dollar transactions, and shaped investment strategies that would eventually find their way to Halstead Partners through carefully Obscured channels. Perhaps the most painful sign emerged during a weekend at his parents' lake house in New Hampshire. James's father, himself a retired investment banker, had asked about my family background over morning coffee on the dock. The Callaways, he mused, recognition flickering across his weathered face. Any relation to Edward Callaway of Callaway? Holdings? Before I could respond, James interjected with a dismissive wave. Distant cousins at best. Olivia's branch of the family wasn't involved in the business side. I remember the cool morning air, the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock, and the peculiar sensation of being erased by the man who had promised to cherish me. My grandfather, the Edward Callaway in question, had built one of New England's most significant private investment firms, the very entity that now quietly funded much of James's success. I said nothing to correct him, noting with detached interest how easily he rewrote my identity to better fit his narrative. It wasn't the lie itself that disturbed me, but the realization that he had never asked enough questions about my background to know the truth. Later that evening, as James and his father discussed market strategies on the porch, his mother sat beside me in the kitchen, ostensibly helping me prepare dessert. Marriage is about compromise, she offered unprompted, her eyes never leaving the pie she was carefully slicing. Men like James and his father, they need to be the head of household. The smartest thing a wife can do is let them believe they're always right, even when we know better. Her knowing glance suggested generations of women maintaining this charade, a conspiracy of silence that preserved domestic harmony at the cost of authenticity. I smiled politely but felt a hollowness expanding within me. Was this the legacy I wanted to continue? The carefully orchestrated dance of calculated submission? The signs became more pronounced as James's professional reputation grew. At every industry event, he would introduce me with diminishing context, from my wife Olivia, who used to work at Blackridge Capital in our early years, to simply my wife Olivia by year 8, to occasionally just my wife by our 10th anniversary. I became an extension of him rather than an individual in these settings, expected to laugh appreciatively at his well-rehearsed anecdotes and defer to his expertise in any group discussion. If I expressed an independent opinion on financial matters, he would often follow with a gentle correction or clarification, as one might guide a well-meaning amateur. What Olivia means to say became a familiar phrase in his conversational repertoire. There was the charity auction where I bid successfully on a rare first edition for our library. As we collected the item, the auctioneer commented on my decisive bidding strategy. "Your wife knows exactly what she wants," he observed to James. "She's had lots of practice spending my money," James replied with a wink, drawing appreciative laughter from those nearby. The book, a first edition Keynes that I'd coveted for my collection on economic theory, was paid for with my personal funds, a fact I never corrected. It now sat in my private study, one of many small treasures that reflected a self James had never bothered to discover. Then there was the dinner with the Prestons, where the conversation turned to early investments in artificial intelligence companies. "Olivia actually has some interesting insights on this," Richard Preston suggested, having served on a charitable board with me where such topics had been discussed. James's laugh was warm but definitive. "Olivia's expertise runs more toward choosing the perfect wine pairing and managing our social calendar." He reached for my hand, squeezing it affectionately. "She leaves the technology investments to me." Richard's eyes had flickered between us, sensing the underlying dynamic but unwilling to challenge it in a social setting. Later, he sent me an article on AI investments with a handwritten note. "Thought you might find this interesting, regardless of what James thinks." The incident that perhaps should have been my breaking point came during a vacation in Santorini 3 years ago. We were having breakfast on our villa's terrace when James received an urgent call from his office regarding a potential investment in a sustainable energy startup. As he discussed the opportunity, I recognized the company immediately, the Callaway. Trust had been an early-stage investor through one of our venture funds, and I had reviewed their quarterly reports just the previous week. When James ended the call, his excitement was palpable. This could be enormous, Liv. Ground floor opportunity. Infusion technology with actual working prototypes. I need to do more due diligence, but my instinct says we should move aggressively. I'm familiar with their technology, I offered. Their approach to plasma containment is innovative, but they're facing regulatory hurdles in Europe that could delay implementation. James stared at me with genuine surprise, followed by indulgent amusement. Been reading the business section of the Globe, have you? Actually, It's cute that you're interested, he continued, already turning, his attention to his phone. But this is highly specialized technology. The regulatory landscape is incredibly complex. I understand that, but... Tell you what, he interrupted again, standing to kiss the top of my head. I need to make some calls. Why don't you book us that sunset cruise you mentioned? This evening should be perfect for it. He disappeared into the villa, leaving me with my untouched coffee and the spectacular view of the caldera. I remember sitting there for a long time, watching ferries traverse the intensely blue water below, feeling a similar chasm widening in my marriage, a deep divide between perception and reality that seemed increasingly unbridgeable. That night, as our private yacht cut through the Aegean waters and James toasted to new opportunities, I made a silent decision. I would no longer volunteer insights or attempt to bridge the gap between my two worlds. I would observe, document, and wait. If James chose to see only the curated version of me he had created in his mind, so be it. The truth would eventually emerge, one way or another. The signs continued to accumulate after that trip. The casual dismissals, the speaking over me in social settings, the automatic assumption that any knowledge I demonstrated about finance or investments must have come from overhearing his phone calls or reading articles he'd left on the coffee table. I began to notice how he subtly reinforced this narrative to others. Olivia has such an eye for detail, he would say to clients visiting our home. She creates the perfect environment for business to happen, never acknowledging that the perfect environment included strategic seating arrangements beside potential clients I had already researched extensively through Callaway channels. Last Christmas, he gifted me an expensive cooking class with a celebrity chef. Since you enjoy hosting so much, the card read. That same week, I had authorized a $50 million position in an emerging markets fund that would eventually be offered to Halstead Partners clients as an exclusive opportunity discovered by James's research team. The irony wasn't lost on me as I unwrapped the cooking school certificate with appropriate enthusiasm, exclaiming over his thoughtfulness while he recorded the moment for his Instagram account. Blessed with the perfect wife. The accumulation of these moments, these signs that had been flashing warning signals for years, crystallized into perfect clarity last weekend at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. The gala celebrating Halstead Partners' 20th anniversary should have been a triumph for both of us. After all, the firm's longevity and success were as much a product of my behind-the-scenes direction as James's public leadership. Yet as I circulated through the ballroom in my Carolina Herrera gown, exchanging pleasantries with Boston's elite, I felt increasingly like an elaborate prop in James's carefully constructed reality. A beautiful, cultured accessory that enhanced his image without threatening to overshadow it. Perhaps that's why, when I overheard his conversation with the new clients, the words cut so deeply. They weren't really a revelation, just the most honest articulation of a perspective he had demonstrated for years. Olivia? She's just a housewife. Sweet as they come, but doesn't have the head for what we do. I keep her busy with charity luncheons and interior decorating. She rearranges the furniture. I rearrange the wealth of Boston. Just a housewife. After 15 years of marriage, after all the contributions I had made to his success, both acknowledged and unacknowledged, that was how he truly saw me. The signs had been there all along. I had simply chosen not to read them clearly until now. The weight of my family name rests differently on my shoulders when I'm alone. In the quiet moments before dawn, when Boston still sleeps and the financial markets of Asia are just closing, I am not Olivia Halstead, James's decorative wife. I am Olivia Calloway, principal trustee of a fortune that stretches back 4 generations and extends its influence across continents. This morning, I sit at my grandfather's desk, rescued from the old Calloway offices during renovations and secretly restored for my private study. James believes it's a reproduction, purchased because it fits the aesthetic of our historic home. He's never recognized the distinctive notch on the left drawer where my grandfather's signet ring once struck in anger during the crash of '87, or noticed the hidden compartment that still holds the original trust documents, yellowed but intact. The Calloway Trust was established in 1927 by my great-grandfather, a shipbuilder who diversified into banking just before the market crash. His foresight saved the family fortune while others crumbled, a lesson in strategic timing that became part of our family ethos. My grandfather expanded the trust's reach internationally in the 1960s, establishing footholds in emerging markets decades before they became fashionable investments. My father, more cautious by nature, consolidated and preserved during his tenure, weathering recessions with minimal losses. And then there was me, youngest ever senior portfolio manager at Blackridge Capital, before assuming control of the family trust at 32 after my father's unexpected death. The trust that James has benefited from for over a decade without ever knowing its true connection to his wife. The irony of our first meeting has not been lost on me over the years. It was at a financial conference in London, where I was representing Blackridge in a panel discussion on emerging market strategies. James was in the audience, a promising young fund manager looking to establish his own boutique firm. He asked an insightful question about currency hedging in Southeast Asian investments, and I provided a detailed response that sparked a lively debate among the panelists. Later, at the reception, he approached me with 2 glasses of champagne and a charming smile. "That was an impressive analysis," he said, handing me a glass. "I've been developing a similar thesis about the Indonesian market. I'd love to get your thoughts." We talked for hours, our conversation flowing from investment, strategies to art, literature, and travel. He was intelligent, ambitious, and refreshingly straightforward about his goals. "I want to build something that stands the test of time," he confided over dinner the following evening. "Not just another finance shop chasing quarterly returns, but a firm with principles and purpose." I found myself drawn to his vision, his energy, his apparent respect for my professional insights. Here, I thought, was a man who saw me completely, who valued my mind as much as any other aspect of me. When he mentioned his plans to launch his own investment firm, I was genuinely interested. "What's your capital strategy?" I asked. The initial years can be challenging for boutique firms. "I've been cultivating some potential investors," he replied. "High net worth individuals who appreciate my approach. But finding the right cornerstone investor, someone who understands the long game, that's the real challenge." 2 months later, back in Boston, the Calloway Trust received a prospectus from James Halstead, outlining his vision for Halstead Partners. It was well-reasoned, with a strong emphasis on value investing and sustainability, areas that aligned with Calloway's investment philosophy. By then, we were dating long distance, with James unaware of my family connections. I deliberately kept my role at the trust separate from our personal relationship, curious to see if his proposal would stand on its own merits. It did. The investment committee, which included my cousin Michael and 3 long-standing advisors, unanimously approved an initial investment in Halstead Partners. "This Halstead has a solid approach," Michael said after reviewing the materials. "Smart risk management, good sectoral diversification. Worth taking a chance on." What my family didn't know, what I hadn't yet disclosed, was my personal relationship with the promising young fund manager. I told myself I was maintaining professional boundaries, ensuring his business was evaluated objectively. In reality, I was testing something more fundamental: whether James would succeed on his own merits without leveraging personal connections. When I finally introduced James to my family, we had been dating for 6 months, and the Callaway Trust had already provided the cornerstone funding for Halstead Partners through several intermediary entities, a common practice for the trust to maintain privacy. I had recused myself from direct decisions regarding his firm, though I maintained oversight as was my fiduciary responsibility. "You never mentioned your boyfriend was the same James Halstead we just invested in," Michael commented after the introduction dinner, his tone more amused than accusatory. "I wanted to be sure the investment decision was made on the merits of his proposal, not our personal connection," I explained. Michael studied me for a moment. "And you haven't told him about your role in the trust?" I shook my head. "He knows my family has some investments, but not the extent of it. I want him to see me, not the Callaway fortune." "Fair enough," Michael replied. "Just be careful, Liv. The lines between personal and professional can blur quickly in this world." I assured him I would maintain appropriate boundaries. What I didn't say was that I was already wrestling with uncomfortable questions about James's perception of me. When we'd met in London, I'd been Olivia Callaway, financial professional. As our relationship developed in Boston, I noticed subtle shifts in his attitude, a growing tendency to explain financial concepts I clearly already understood, a hint of surprise when I offered market insights. The proposal came just before the 1-year mark of our relationship, a perfectly orchestrated evening at l'Espalier, followed by a walk through the public garden where a string quartet happened to be playing my favorite Debussy piece. James dropped to one knee beside the lagoon, offering a flawless 3-carat diamond that caught the strategic lighting he'd arranged. "Olivia, you've brought such warmth and beauty into my life," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a speech he'd rehearsed. "I want to build a future with you by my side." What struck me, even in that moment, was the absence of any mention of my mind, my insights, the professional capabilities he had once admired. It was as if he were proposing to a different woman, entirely, one defined solely by the comfort and aesthetic pleasure she provided. Still, I said yes. I told myself that marriage was about more than professional recognition, that our connection transcended career identities. I believed, perhaps naively, that once we settled into married life, the full spectrum of who I was would reassert itself in our relationship. The months leading up to our wedding coincided with the rapid growth of Halstead Partners. James secured several high-profile clients, made a few remarkably prescient investment calls, and began to establish himself as a rising star in Boston's financial community. What he didn't know was that many of those coincidental introductions to potential clients came through Callaway connections, subtly facilitated by long-standing family associates who had been asked to keep an eye on this promising young manager. By our wedding day, Halstead Partners was managing close to $100 million in assets, the impressive achievement for a firm less than 2 years old. James was ebullient, confident, increasingly recognized at industry events and in financial publications. "It's extraordinary how quickly you've built your reputation," my grandfather commented during our reception, his eyes sharp despite his 87 years. "Most new managers struggle for a decade to achieve what you've done in 2 years. James offered a practiced smile. "I've been fortunate to connect with the right people at the right time, and having Olivia's support has been invaluable." "Oh? In what way?" my grandfather pressed, his tone casual but his gaze intent. James placed his hand over mine. "She creates the perfect home environment for me to focus entirely on business. No distractions, just support." I watched something flicker in my grandfather's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or concern. He had been the one to encourage my early interest in finance, to celebrate my academic achievements at Wharton, to mentor me through my rise at Blackridge. He had entrusted the family legacy to my stewardship, confident in my ability to preserve and grow it for future generations. "Is that all she contributes?" he asked, his voice carrying a subtle edge that James seemed to miss entirely. "Well, she's also quite the social asset," James added with a laugh. "Opens doors that might otherwise stay closed." My grandfather's gaze shifted to me, a silent question in his eyes. I squeezed his hand gently, a private signal between us since my childhood, asking for his trust. He nodded almost imperceptibly before excusing himself. Later that evening, he found me alone for a moment. "Are you sure about this man, Olivia?" he asked, his voice low. "He doesn't seem to recognize what he has in you." "He's building something worthwhile," I replied. "The firm has solid fundamentals and a responsible approach." "I'm not asking about his business acumen," my grandfather said. "I'm asking if he sees you, the real you." I hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the complex calculations I'd been making. "He saw me once," I finally said, "in London when we first met. I believe that version of him still exists." My grandfather studied me for a long moment. "Just remember what I've always taught you, Olivia. True power doesn't need to announce itself, but it should never be surrendered either." Those words echoed in my mind during the early years of our marriage, as I maintained my dual existence. Olivia Halstead in public, the quintessential corporate wife. Olivia Calloway in private, directing one of New England's most significant family fortunes. The Calloway Trust continued to support Halstead Partners through various channels: direct investments, client referrals, strategic introductions. I established careful protocols to ensure these connections were never too obvious, working through intermediaries and maintaining plausible deniability. From James's perspective, his firm was thriving through his own brilliance and market insight. From mine, it was a carefully orchestrated performance, with the trust providing unseen scaffolding. What James never knew was how often his brilliant market calls originated in research conducted by Calloway analysts, filtered through channels that eventually reached his desk as seemingly independent insights. He never noticed how many of his chance encounters with wealthy potential clients were actually arranged through Calloway connections, or how frequently his access to exclusive investment opportunities came through doors the trust had quietly opened. His expansion into sustainable investing, the move that cemented his reputation as a forward-thinking manager, was directly inspired by a Calloway initiative I had championed 2 years earlier. When James discovered the potential of ESG investments, enthusiastically outlining his vision over dinner one evening, I nodded and asked appropriate questions, never revealing that I had already directed significant Calloway assets into the same sector. "This is the future of responsible wealth management," he declared, spreading research reports across our dining table. "Most of the old guard doesn't see it yet, but there's tremendous value here, both financial and social." "It sounds fascinating," I replied, noting that several of the companies in his presentation were ones the trust had invested in months earlier. "What made you explore this particular direction?" "Intuition," he said with characteristic confidence, "and spotting patterns others miss. It's what separates the truly exceptional in our field." I suppressed a smile, recalling the extensive research dossier on sustainable investments I'd reviewed with the Trust's investment committee the previous quarter, research that had somehow found its way into Halstead Partners' information stream through carefully obscured channels. As the years passed, the Trust's influence over Halstead Partners grew more sophisticated. We weren't merely providing capital and connections. We were subtly shaping the firm's strategic direction, guiding it towards sectors and approaches the Calloway Trust had already determined were promising. James believed he was charting his own course, unaware that many of the favorable winds filling his sails were generated by Callaway resources. By our 5th anniversary, Halstead Partners was managing over $500 million, with James increasingly recognized as an innovative voice in Boston's financial community. The firm had moved into prestigious offices on State Street, expanded to a staff of 20, and established a reputation for consistently outperforming market benchmarks. What remained invisible was the careful choreography happening behind the scenes, the trust's strategic deployments that created favorable conditions for Halstead's success. "Your husband's doing remarkably well," Esther Chen observed during one of our quarterly trust reviews. "His returns are impressive, even accounting for the advantages he's unknowingly received." "He has genuine talent," I acknowledged. "He's intelligent, persuasive, and good at building client relationships." "And completely unaware of who's really behind his success," Michael added, not unkindly. "Don't you ever want to tell him, Liv? Take credit for what you've built?" I considered the question carefully. The truth was complicated. Part of me did want recognition, not just from James, but from the financial community that increasingly celebrated him while overlooking my continued influence in the field. Another part recognized the strategic advantage of remaining in the shadows, operating with the freedom that anonymity provided. "The structure works," I finally replied. "The trust maintains its privacy. Halstead Partners generates solid returns for our investment, and the separation protects both entities." What I didn't articulate was the growing discomfort I felt about my marriage, the widening gulf between who I truly was and who James believed he had married. Each time he explained basic market concepts to me over breakfast, each dismissive pat on the hand when I offered an investment insight, each introduction as "my wife," without any acknowledgement of my professional capabilities. These moments accumulated like small weights, gradually tilting the balance of our relationship. By our 10th anniversary, the Callaway Trust had diversified its support of Halstead Partners, maintaining significant positions but distributing them across various entities to minimize visibility. The firm now managed over $2 billion, with James firmly established as a leading voice in sustainable investing and wealth management. He had been profiled in financial publications, invited to speak at prestigious conferences, and courted by the major networks as a market commentator. What? None of these profiles mentioned what no one outside a small circle knew was the invisible hand that had guided so much of this success. The Callaway influence remained carefully concealed, with James himself the most oblivious to its existence. Our 15th anniversary approached with Halstead Partners at its zenith. Assets under management had surpassed $4 billion. The firm employed over 70 people across 3 offices, and James had achieved the recognition he had always craved. Yet our marriage had settled into a pattern that increasingly felt like a performance. James, the brilliant financial mind, me, the supportive corporate wife who created the perfect domestic backdrop for his success. The fiction might have continued indefinitely if not for the Fairmont Copley Plaza Gala. The moment when I heard him dismiss me so completely, "She's just a housewife," crystallized years of growing disillusionment. It wasn't just the dismissal itself, but the casual certainty with which he delivered it, the absolute confidence that this was the sum total of my identity and contribution. In that moment, standing in the shadow of a marble column in my Carolina Herrera gown, I made a decision that had perhaps been years in the making. It was time for Olivia Callaway to step out of the shadows. Time for the truth about Halstead Partners. Success to emerge. Time for James to see, truly see, the woman he had married. The mechanics were straightforward. As principal trustee, I had the authority to redirect the Callaway investments that flowed through Halstead Partners. A strategic reallocation, perfectly legal and within my fiduciary responsibilities. Not a vindictive withdrawal, but a recalibration that would illuminate the actual foundations of the firm's success. The morning after the gala, I contacted Esther Chen to begin the process. Michael joined our conference call. his initial surprise giving way to understanding as I explained what I had overheard. "It's been 15 years, Liv," he said. "Maybe it's finally time for some transparency." "Not just transparency," I clarified. "Accountability. Recognition of what's actually been happening all these years." "The Trust's investment objectives haven't changed," Esther noted, ever the pragmatist. "Any realignment needs to serve those objectives first and foremost." "Absolutely," I agreed. "This isn't about revenge. It's about honesty, and about establishing clearer governance over resources the Trust has committed. James's firm has benefited from Callaway support without the accountability that should accompany it." Over the next 5 days, we methodically prepared the necessary documentation. Not a complete withdrawal. That would be needlessly destructive to a fundamentally sound business, but a significant restructuring that would make the Trust's role impossible to ignore. The quarterly distribution would be held in abeyance pending a formal review of governance structures. Specific investments would be flagged for enhanced oversight. And most significantly, James would be summoned to a direct meeting with the Trust's principal trustees, a meeting where he would finally learn exactly who controlled the fortune that had enabled his success. What James didn't know, what he had never bothered to discover despite 15 years of marriage, was that the woman he dismissed as just a housewife was in fact the architect of the financial ecosystem in which he operated. The Callaway Trust didn't just support Halstead Partners. In many ways, it had created the conditions for its very existence. This morning, as I authorized the holding of the quarterly distribution, $7 million that would typically flow seamlessly into Halstead Partners operations, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not triumph or vindication, but the quiet certainty that comes with finally aligning one's public and private selves. James was about to discover what I had known all along, that the Callaway fortune wasn't just wealth to be managed, it was a responsibility to be honored, and that the woman he had underestimated for 15 years was, in fact, the power behind the throne he believed he had built entirely on his own. The secret that had defined our marriage was about to be revealed, not in anger or with malice, but with the clear-eyed precision that had guided my stewardship of the Callaway legacy. It was time for James to see me, truly see me, for perhaps the first time since we'd met. The Fairmont Copley Plaza had been transformed for Halstead Partners' 20th anniversary gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the grand ballroom, where nearly 300 of Boston's financial and social elite mingled among elaborate floral arrangements of white orchids and blue hydrangeas. The firm's signature colors adorned everything from the custom napkins to the lighting design that washed the ornate ceiling in subtle gradients of navy and silver. I had spent weeks overseeing the planning, coordinating with event designers, selecting the menu, and curating the guest list with James's executive assistant. From the hand-calligraphed place cards to the signature cocktails named after the firm's most successful funds, every detail reflected the image James wanted to project: sophisticated, established, exclusive. An institution rather than merely a business. My Carolina Herrera gown, midnight blue with subtle beading that caught the light as I moved, had been selected months in advance. James had approved it with a distracted nod during one of our rare shared breakfasts, commenting, only that the color coordinated well with the event branding. I wore my grandmother's sapphires, pieces that had been photographed at Manhattan gallery openings in the 1960s and Boston Symphony galas for generations since, though James had always assumed they were contemporary pieces I'd selected for their aesthetic appeal rather than their history. The evening had unfolded precisely as planned. James delivered a polished address about market vision and client trust, acknowledging his leadership team with practiced magnanimity before accepting a Crystal Award commemorating the firm's 2 decades of growth. I stood at the appropriate moment, applauded at the designated pauses, and maintained the serene smile expected of the founder's wife throughout the 15-minute speech. Afterward, as James was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and potential clients, I circulated through the ballroom with practiced ease. I exchanged pleasantries with the wives of James's associates, discussed upcoming charity events with long-standing clients, and smoothly facilitated introductions between key figures in Boston's overlapping financial and philanthropic circles. The role I had perfected over 15 years, the consummate corporate spouse, enhancing her husband's professional standing through social grace and strategic connections. "Olivia, the event is magnificent," Eleanor Whitcomb commented, air-kissing both my cheeks. "You've outdone yourself." "James must be thrilled," added Patricia Morgan, whose family office had been among Halstead Partners' earliest clients, directed there, though she didn't know it, through Callaway connections. "He's certainly enjoying the recognition," I replied, my gaze drifting to where my husband stood holding court near the main bar, surrounded by admiring associates and potential investors. "As he should," Patricia nodded. "Building something like this from nothing, it's quite remarkable." I smiled noncommittally, long accustomed to the fiction that Halstead Partners had emerged solely from James's brilliance and determination, rather than with substantial backing from one of Boston's oldest fortunes. The myth of the self-made man was one James had cultivated carefully, and one I had allowed to flourish around him. After nearly 2 hours of continuous conversation and careful social navigation, I excused myself to visit the powder room. The hallway leading away from the ballroom offered a momentary respite from the orchestrated perfection of the event, a chance to exhale the persona I had maintained all evening and briefly reclaim myself. The Fairmont's Ladies' Lounge was blissfully quiet, with just one other woman refreshing her lipstick at the marble vanity. I nodded politely to her as I entered one of the velvet-upholstered sitting areas, taking a moment to simply breathe without the requirement of performance. These small intermissions had become increasingly necessary over the years, brief pauses where I could shed the carefully constructed identity of Olivia Halstead and reconnect with the woman beneath. After reapplying my lipstick and adjusting a loose pin in my chignon, I prepared to re-enter the fray. The gala would continue for at least another 2 hours, and James would expect me to maintain my role throughout, the elegant, supportive wife who enhanced his professional image through her impeccable social polish. I was nearly back to the ballroom when I heard James's distinctive laugh, that particular chuckle he reserved for business associates he was trying to impress. It carried from a small alcove near the service entrance, partially hidden by an ornate Chinese screen that had been positioned as part of the event decor. Automatically, I slowed my steps. Years of navigating professional events had taught me to be alert to James's whereabouts, to be ready to join him seamlessly if he signaled for my presence or to continue circulating independently if he was engaged in business discussions. "Honestly, I don't know how you do it all, Halstead," a man's voice carried from behind the screen. "Building a firm this successful while maintaining any kind of personal life seems impossible." I recognized the speaker as Andrew Fielding, the CEO of a prominent tech company who had recently relocated his family from Silicon Valley to Boston's western suburbs. James had been courting his business for months, recognizing both the substantial assets Fielding's family office might direct to Halstead Partners and the cachet such a client would add to the firm's reputation. "Balance is the key," James replied, his voice carrying that particular blend of confidence and casual authority he had perfected for client interactions. "Clear boundaries between work and home." "That's easier said than done," another male voice added. Thomas Chen, I believed, a potential investor James had been especially keen to impress tonight. "How do you manage to stay so focused at work with such a distraction at home?" There was a brief pause, during which I could almost picture James's practiced, modest smile, the one he deployed when receiving compliments he fully believed he deserved. "Olivia?" James's laugh was dismissive but not unkind, the sound of a man accustomed to explaining realities to those who didn't fully understand the world as he experienced it. "She's just a housewife. Sweet as they come, but doesn't have the head for what we do. I keep her busy with charity luncheons and interior decorating. She rearranges the furniture. I rearrange the wealth of Boston." Male laughter followed, the comfortable, conspiratorial sounds of men who recognized and appreciated the implicit hierarchy being described. I remained perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the patterned silk of the Chinese screen, my body temperature seeming to drop several degrees despite the warmth of the crowded venue. "Smart system," Fielding commented approvingly. "My wife's always trying to understand my business deals. Asks too many questions." "That's the mistake most guys make," James continued, warming to his theme. "They marry accomplished women who can't switch it off, always bringing work stress home, wanting to discuss strategy over dinner. Exhausting." "So, you went the traditional route," Chen observed. "Traditional with modern styling," James replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Olivia has the perfect background for my needs. Good family, excellent education, knows which fork to use at state dinners. But she's never had real career ambitions. No competition, no professional jealousy. Just support." I had been motionless for so long that a passing server asked if I needed assistance. I shook my head silently, unable to formulate words as James continued. "She was at some investment shop when we met. Back office role, I think. Couldn't wait to leave it behind. For something more fulfilling. Now she runs our household like a CEO, handles our social calendar, serves on the right charitable boards. It's the perfect arrangement." The back office role. The prestigious Blackridge Capital Senior Portfolio Manager position I had reached. At 29, after earning dual degrees from Wharton, the role that had placed me on the industry panel in London where James had first approached me, impressed by my market insights. "She must be good with the clients' wives, too," Fielding suggested. "That's an underrated business asset." "Invaluable," James agreed. "She keeps the wives happy with lunch dates and gallery openings while I handle the serious conversations with their husbands. Half my client retention strategy is how well Olivia connects with the spouses." The men's voices began to move, indicating they were returning to the main ballroom. I stepped quickly behind a large floral arrangement, unwilling to be discovered, eavesdropping on what James clearly considered a private professional conversation. "You'll have to introduce me to your wife properly," Chen was saying as they passed my hiding place. "My Julia is always looking for new connections in Boston." "Absolutely," James replied. "Olivia would be delighted to take her shopping on Newbury Street. She knows all the boutique managers by name. They call her when special pieces arrive that match her aesthetic. Another perk of the arrangement." Their voices faded as they re-entered the ballroom, leaving me alone in the suddenly too quiet hallway. I remained motionless, my breathing shallow, the phrases echoing in my mind with devastating clarity. "Just a housewife. Doesn't have the head for what we do. Back office role. Never had real career ambitions." Each dismissal landed like a physical blow, confirming suspicions I had harbored but never fully acknowledged. That the man I had married saw me not as an equal whose capabilities complemented his own, but as an ornamental asset acquired to enhance his professional standing and personal comfort. What struck me most powerfully wasn't the disrespect itself. I had witnessed that in 100 small ways over our years together, but the absolute certainty with which he had delivered his assessment. There was no hesitation, no qualification, no hint that he recognized the disparity between his perception and reality. In James's mind, I was exactly what he had described. Just a housewife, intellectually unequipped for the sophisticated world of finance he inhabited. The irony was so profound it briefly threatened to overwhelm me. The man dismissing my financial acumen had built his career on foundations established by my family's fortune. The investment strategies he proudly claimed as his unique insights had often originated in research I had commissioned or analyses I had reviewed. The wealth of Boston he so confidently claimed to rearrange flowed significantly from decisions made in my private study, under my direction as principal trustee of an entity he had benefited from without ever fully understanding. For 15 years, I had maintained the fiction he required, the elegant, supportive wife without professional ambitions of her own. I had allowed him to believe that his success derived solely from his own brilliance, rather than from the carefully orchestrated support structure I had established around him. I had subjugated my public identity to enhance his, stepping into the shadows while he claimed the spotlight. And he had accepted this arrangement, not with gratitude or recognition of the sacrifice it entailed, but with the entitled assumption that it represented the natural order of things, the accomplished man and his decorative wife, the financial genius and his social secretary, just a housewife. I don't recall exactly how long I stood there processing what I had heard. Long enough that a concerned member of the event staff eventually approached, asking if I needed assistance. "No," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "Thank you. I'm fine." And in that moment, I realized it was true. I was fine, or rather, I would be. Because the words I had overheard, painful as they were, had severed something within me. The last thread of illusion about what my marriage had become and what it could never be. I straightened my shoulders, checked my reflection in a decorative mirror, and adjusted my expression to the serene smile expected of James Halstead's wife. Then I re-entered the ballroom, circulating among guests with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and facilitating connections as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. With each air kiss, each light touch on a client's arm, each murmured introduction, I was acutely conscious of the role I was performing, and of the decision crystallizing within me. James found me an hour later, his hand settling possessively at the small of my back as he steered me toward a group of potential investors. "There you are," he murmured against my ear. "The Chens want to set up a dinner next week. Thomas's wife. Julia is new to Boston, and I told him you'd be happy to show her around." "Of course," I replied automatically. "I'd be delighted." He squeezed my waist approvingly before turning to make introductions. "Thomas, Julia, this is my wife, Olivia." Just that. No mention of my educational background, my previous career, my current philanthropic leadership. Simply, my wife, Olivia. An appendage rather than an individual. I watched with a strange detachment as James launched into a well-practiced anecdote about our first meeting, a heavily edited version that positioned him as the seasoned finance professional impressed by my charm, rather than by my market insights. In his retelling, I was reduced to a decorative presence he had pursued, rather than the financial expert whose analysis had initially caught his attention. "She had no idea I was tracking her movements around that reception," James laughed, his arm still around my waist. I had to strategically position myself by the canapes to engineer another encounter. The Chens laughed appreciatively, absorbing the narrative James had constructed. The successful man pursuing the beautiful woman, the traditional courtship culminating in the perfect corporate marriage. I smiled at the appropriate moments, added the expected self-deprecating comment about being oblivious to his interest until he was impossible to ignore. Played my assigned role in this carefully scripted performance, while a separate part of my consciousness observed with clinical detachment. Throughout the remainder of the evening, I found myself hyper-aware of James's casual dismissals. The way he interrupted my comments to clients, the automatic corrections when I expressed opinions on market trends, the subtle physical cues indicating when I should withdraw from conversations turning toward serious financial matters. Behaviors that had once seemed merely irritating now registered as symptoms of a fundamental misalignment in how he perceived me versus who I actually was. The gap wasn't just wide, it was unbridgeable. James didn't simply underestimate me, he fundamentally misunderstood who I was, what I valued, and what I contributed not just to our marriage, but to his professional success. Just a housewife. The phrase continued to echo as we bid farewell to the last lingering guests near midnight. It resonated as we thanked the event staff and hotel management. It accompanied us into the back of the town car that would return us to Beacon Hill. where James immediately began reviewing the evening's networking successes on his phone. "Fielding's definitely in," he announced with satisfaction. "Said he'll have his office call Monday to set up the account transfer. And the Chens are strongly leaning our way. Dinner next week should seal it. You don't have anything that can't be rescheduled Thursday, right?" "No," I replied, gazing out at the city lights reflecting off the Charles River. "Nothing that can't be moved." "Perfect. Julia Chen apparently collects antique jewelry, right up your alley. You can take her to that little place on Newbury Street you're always talking about." I murmured agreement, mentally noting that I had never expressed particular interest in antique jewelry or mentioned any specific shop on Newbury Street. These were details James had invented to support his construction of who he believed me to be, the decorative wife with appropriately feminine interests. "The Richardsons asked when we're hosting another dinner," he continued, still scrolling through his phone. "I was thinking next month, once the dining room refresh is complete. That new table you ordered should accommodate two Lev comfortably, right?" Again, I offered confirmation, watching his satisfied nod with the strange detachment that had accompanied me since overhearing his conversation with Fielding and Chen. James genuinely believed he had engineered the perfect marriage, a partnership, where he managed the important matters of finance and business while I attended to the decorative backdrop of our shared existence. He had no idea that the woman beside him in the darkened town car was already calculating the precise sequence of actions that would dismantle this carefully constructed fiction. No sense that Olivia Calloway was emerging from the shadows where Olivia Halstead had kept her carefully hidden for 15 years. As we arrived home, James immediately headed to his study to send a few time-sensitive emails to potential clients he'd connected with at the gala. I moved through our quiet house with new awareness, noting how every space had been designed to showcase James's success and facilitate his comfort. The antique partner desk in his study, selected because it conveyed established wealth rather than new money. The carefully curated library of financial classics and leather-bound first editions he rarely opened but prominently displayed for visiting clients. The vintage Patek Philippe clock on the mantel that he proudly told guests had been in the family for generations, despite having been purchased at auction specifically to create that impression. An entire residence designed to enhance the mythology James had constructed around himself, the narrative of the brilliant, self-made financial mind who had built Halstead Partners through pure talent and determination. And I had enabled this fiction. More than enabled. I had architected it, selecting each element to reinforce the image James wished to project while simultaneously directing the Calloway resources that had made his success possible. I had been both set designer and invisible producer of the James Halstead show, ensuring the spotlight remained firmly on him while I operated the machinery from the wings. Just a housewife. I climbed the stairs to my private study on the 3rd floor, the space James still referred to as my hobby room, despite never having fully explored its contents. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the contrast between this space and the rest of our home struck me anew. Here, nothing was for show. Every element served a purpose. The specialized computer setup for secure financial transactions, the organized files documenting years of Calloway Trust operations, the reference books I actually read and consulted regularly. I sank into my grandfather's desk chair, running my fingers over the familiar notch in the left drawer, the tangible connection to the legacy I maintained. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had known subconsciously for years, that my marriage had become a form of professional theater, with James and me playing roles that had increasingly diverged from our authentic selves. Or rather, I had been playing a role. James, I suspected, had been exactly himself throughout. A man so confident in his own narrative that he had never questioned the convenient fiction that his wife was exactly what he needed her to be. Supportive, decorative, and intellectually unthreatening. Just a housewife. The phrase that had triggered something irreversible within me. Not just anger or hurt, but a fundamental reassessment of the bargain I had struck in maintaining my dual identity. For 15 years, I had justified the compartmentalization of my life as necessary for both personal and professional reasons, protecting the Calloway privacy while allowing James to develop his business identity independently. But the evening's revelation had exposed the fundamental flaw in this arrangement. It wasn't just that James didn't know the full extent of my involvement in his success. He fundamentally misunderstood and devalued who I was as a person. The gap wasn't a simple matter of missing information. It was a profound failure of recognition and respect. As I sat in the quiet of my private study, surrounded by the evidence of my true professional identity, the path forward crystallized with surprising clarity, not a vindictive exposure designed to humiliate, but a methodical revelation of truth that would realign our relationship, personal and professional, with reality rather than convenient fiction. Just a housewife. The trigger had been pulled. The carefully maintained equilibrium of our marriage had been disrupted beyond repair. And now, after 15 years of shadows and misdirection, it was time for Olivia Calloway to step into the light, and for James to finally see the woman he had actually married. My grandfather's voice was clearest in the early mornings. Something about the quality of light as it filtered through the leaded glass windows of my study, catching dust motes and beams of amber and gold, seemed to summon his presence beside me. I could almost see him there in the leather chair across from my desk, teacup balanced on his knee, silver eyebrows raised in that particular expression he reserved for moments of financial contemplation. Never mistake wealth for value, Olivia. His first lesson, delivered on my 8th birthday when he had taken me to view the Calloway shipping archives. Fragile manifests and ledgers from the 1880s, carefully preserved in climate-controlled cases. What you're seeing here isn't just the history of our fortune. It's the record of decisions, choices made by people who understood the difference between acquiring money and creating worth. I poured my Earl Grey from the silver pot, another Calloway heirloom, this one dating from the 1920s when my great-grandfather had diversified from shipping into banking. The familiar ritual grounded me as I considered the path ahead. 15 years of careful compartmentalization were about to end, the separate worlds I had maintained. Olivia Halstead, the corporate wife, and Olivia Calloway, the financial steward, colliding in what would certainly be a seismic disruption. Let them chase the spotlight, my grandfather had advised, watching a 22-year-old me prepare for my first major presentation at Blackridge Capital. The real decisions happen in the shadows. It had become something of a family philosophy, over the generations. While other Boston fortunes emblazoned their names on university buildings and hospital wings, the Calloways operated with deliberate discretion. Our philanthropic gifts were substantial but typically anonymous. Our investment strategies were sophisticated but rarely publicized. Our influence was significant but intentionally understated. True financial power operates best in silence, my grandfather insisted. This wasn't about secrecy for its own sake, but about the strategic advantage that came with being underestimated, the freedom to maneuver without the constraints of public attention or expectation. I had embraced this approach naturally, finding comfort in the ability to observe and analyze without being the focus of observation myself. Even at Blackridge, where my rapid rise had attracted some industry attention, I had deflected profiles in financial publications and declined speaking engagements at high-profile conferences. "She's brilliant but pathologically private," I once overheard my managing director explain to a financial journalist seeking an interview. "Prefers to let her returns speak for themselves." That orientation toward privacy had made my initial decision to keep the full extent of my Calloway connections separate from my relationship with James seem natural rather than calculated. In those early days, I told myself it was about ensuring an authentic connection, wanting to be valued for myself rather than for my family's fortune. But as our relationship progressed, that separation had calcified into something more problematic. What began as a desire for authentic connection became an accommodation of James's need to see himself as the primary financial authority in our relationship. And eventually, it transformed into a tacit acceptance of his diminished perception of me, the just a housewife identity that had never aligned with my actual capabilities or contributions. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the eastern wall of my study where I had hung a simple ink drawing, a lighthouse standing firm against stylized waves. It had been my grandfather's last gift to me before his death, accompanied by a note in his distinctive slanted handwriting. "Remember what guides you home when seas are rough." I studied it now, considering what had truly guided me through the years. Not just financial acumen or strategic thinking, but a deeper set of principles about how wealth should function in the world. Values that had been instilled in me from childhood, reinforced through my education, and tested in my professional roles. "The Callaway money isn't just wealth, Olivia," my grandfather had explained when I assumed control of the trust at 32. "It's a responsibility. Use it only to build, never to break, unless something needs breaking." That last phrase had always fascinated me. My grandfather, typically so measured and strategic, acknowledging that there were times when creative destruction was necessary, when existing structures needed to be dismantled to allow for something better to emerge. Unless something needs breaking. As I sipped my tea in the strengthening morning light, I recognized that the carefully maintained fiction of my marriage had become exactly such a structure. A construction that no longer served any purpose beyond perpetuating James's convenient misunderstanding of who I was and what I contributed to our shared life. The intercom on my desk chimed softly, Mrs. Winters alerting me that breakfast was ready. I acknowledged the message and finished my tea, mentally shifting gears for the day ahead. James would be in New York until tomorrow evening, ostensibly, for meetings with potential clients, but more likely attending to his relationship with Cynthia Powell, the art consultant whose text messages appeared with increasing frequency on his supposedly private phone. I had known about Cynthia for nearly 8 months, not through jealous surveillance or hired investigators, but through the routine financial oversight the trust maintained on all its significant investments. Unusual expenses at hotels where no client meetings were scheduled, a Manhattan pied-à-terre leased through a shell company that James believed was untraceable, regular purchases at Tiffany that never made their way to our Beacon Hill townhouse. I had noted these developments with a detachment that might have seemed cold to an outside observer, but which reflected my grandfather's pragmatic approach to unexpected data points. Observe, document, and integrate into your decision-making, without emotional distortion. Emotions are valuable signals but dangerous drivers, he would say, reviewing quarterly performance reports with me during my teenage apprenticeship. Note what you feel, then set it aside to examine the facts clearly. So I had noted my feelings about James's infidelity, the initial hurt, the subsequent anger, the eventual resignation, and then set them aside to consider the larger pattern they revealed. Not just marital dishonesty, but a fundamental lack of respect for the partnership we had established. A willingness to maintain appearances while violating the underlying trust. A pattern entirely consistent with his dismissive characterization of me as just a housewife. I descended to the breakfast room, where Mrs. Winters had arranged the morning papers alongside a perfectly prepared soft-boiled egg and whole-grain toast. Another daily ritual, this one visible to the household staff, and consistent with the image of Olivia Halstead, the corporate wife whose primary concerns were maintaining the domestic sphere and supporting her husband's career. Mr. Halstead called. "While you were in your study," Mrs. Winters informed me, "he asked that you confirm the dinner with the Montgomerys tomorrow evening. Apparently there was some confusion about the reservation." "Thank you," I replied, opening the Wall Street Journal to scan the morning's financial headlines. "I'll handle it." She hesitated at the doorway. He also mentioned that his return flight might be delayed, something about extending his meetings with clients. I met her eyes briefly, noting the careful neutrality in her expression. Mrs. Winters had managed our household for a decade and undoubtedly had her own observations about the patterns in our marriage. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. That's helpful to know. Alone again, I reviewed the front-page story about a major tech company's unexpected earnings miss. The article quoted several prominent analysts, including Thomas Chen, one of the men who had stood with James during the conversation I had overheard at the gala. Chen's analysis was insightful, but overlooked a key factor in the company's supply chain vulnerability, something the Callaway Trust's research team had identified months earlier. I made a mental note to review our position in the sector, then checked my secure phone for messages from Esther Chen. The documentation for our strategic realignment would be ready by 11, requiring only my final authorization to proceed. By this afternoon, the first phase of dismantling the fiction of our marriage would begin, not with emotional confrontation, but with the methodical adjustment of financial flows that had sustained James's professional identity. As I finished my breakfast, I considered again my grandfather's guidance about the responsible use of wealth. The trust's adjustment of its relationship with Halstead Partners wasn't motivated by vindictiveness or retaliation. It was a necessary correction, an alignment of governance with reality, ensuring that resources were being deployed with appropriate oversight and accountability. Money follows intention, my grandfather would say. Make sure your intention is worthy of the power it wields. My intention now was clarity, establishing transparent governance over resources that had been deployed without sufficient acknowledgement of their source or the expectations attached to them. If James had built a business that provided genuine value, this restructuring would simply place it on more honest foundations. If his success had been more dependent on Callaway's support than he realized, that reality needed to be addressed directly rather than perpetuated through continued fiction. I returned to my study to review the final documentation Esther had prepared. The legal language was precise and dispassionate, a formal notification of the Trust's decision to implement enhanced governance procedures regarding its investments in Halstead Partners. No mention of my personal connection to James or the years of coordinated support the Trust had provided. Simply a clear statement of fiduciary responsibility and procedural adjustment. My cousin Michael had questioned this approach during our planning discussions. "Are you sure you don't want to be more direct?" he had asked. "Make it clear that this is coming from you specifically?" "The trust isn't my personal instrument," I had reminded him, echoing another of my grandfather's frequent teachings. "It's a multi-generational responsibility that operates according to established principles, not individual impulses." And that was true, as far as it went. The Callaway Trust had existed before me and would continue long after, guided by a consistent philosophy about wealth creation and responsible stewardship. But Michael's question had touched on the personal dimension of the decision. The fact that this particular adjustment was motivated not just by abstract fiduciary duty, but by a specific recognition that my marriage had become an unsustainable fiction. As I reviewed the final documents, I found myself returning to my grandfather's wisdom about the nature of true power. He had never defined it in terms of dominance or control, but rather as the capacity to effect meaningful change, to build, to nurture, to protect, and when necessary, to recalibrate systems that had drifted from their intended purpose. "Power that needs to announce itself isn't real power," he would observe, watching Boston's nouveau riche compete for social prominence with conspicuous displays of wealth. "Real power is evident in outcomes, not pronouncements." For 15 years, I had exercised my power quietly, directing Callaway resources in ways that supported James's professional development while maintaining the fiction that his success derived solely from his own brilliance. I had considered this arrangement a form of generosity, allowing him the spotlight while I operated effectively in the shadows. But I now recognized that this generosity had devolved into something unhealthy, an enabling of James's profoundly distorted perception of our relationship and respective contributions. By maintaining the fiction that he was the financial authority in our marriage, I had inadvertently reinforced his dismissive assessment of my capabilities and worth. Just a housewife. The phrase that had crystallized years of subtle dismissals into a single, undeniable revelation. Not just about how James perceived me, but about how I had allowed myself to be perceived, the degree to which I had accommodated a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I contributed. I signed the authorization forms and encrypted them for transmission to Esther's office. The process had begun, the methodical dismantling of a fiction that no longer served any purpose beyond perpetuating a fundamental imbalance in my marriage and professional life. As I completed this task, my private line rang, the secure connection used only for Callaway Trust business. The caller ID displayed ECH, my grandfather's initials, and the code used for urgent communications from the Trust's senior advisors. Olivia Callaway, I answered, using my family name deliberately despite being in my own home. Olivia, it's Michael. My cousin's voice carried an unusual tension. We've just received some concerning information about Halstead Partners' exposure to the Meridian situation. Meridian Global was a multinational conglomerate facing potential regulatory action over accounting irregularities. A developing story that hadn't yet reached the mainstream financial press, but was causing significant concern in specialized circles. What's our exposure? I asked, immediately shifting into risk assessment mode. Direct investment is limited, about $30 million through diversified vehicles. But here's the issue. Our intelligence suggests Halstead Partners has taken a much larger position than reported in their quarterly disclosures to us. Potentially over $200 million through structured products that aren't immediately visible on their balance sheet. I absorbed this information with growing concern. The trust maintained strict risk management protocols for all its investments, with clear limits on exposure to any single entity or sector. If Halstead Partners had indeed accumulated a $200 million position in a company facing regulatory challenges, it represented not just a financial risk, but a potential breach of the governance expectations the trust maintained for its investment vehicles. Do we have confirmation? I asked, already reaching for my secure laptop to access the trust's risk management systems. 3 independent sources, Michael replied. Our analyst at Goldman flagged unusual options activity last week. Then our contact at the SEC mentioned Halstead specifically in connection with Meridian's disclosure review. Finally, one of James's portfolio managers reached out directly to Esther this morning, concerned about the firm's risk concentration. This last detail was particularly alarming. If someone within Halstead's organization felt compelled to contact the trust's legal counsel directly, it suggested the situation might be even more serious than initially indicated. Have we raised this with James directly? I asked, though I already anticipated the answer. That's the other issue, Michael said, his voice tightening further. He's been unreachable for the trust's risk management team. His office says he's in client meetings in New York, but our attempts to schedule an urgent call have been deflected. Client meetings. The fiction covering his time with Cynthia Powell, now intersecting with a potential financial crisis that could impact not just Halstead Partners but the Callaway Trust's broader portfolio. I see, I said, my tone neutral despite the implications crystallizing in my mind. Please ask Esther to add a formal risk review requirement to the governance documentation we're implementing. Specific reference to the Meridian exposure with a mandatory response timeline of 24 hours. Already in process, Michael confirmed. But Olivia, this raises questions about what else might be happening at Halstead that we're not seeing. If they've concealed this level of risk concentration, he didn't need to complete the thought. We both understood the implications. If James was willing to obscure significant risk exposure from the trust that provided his foundational funding, what other decisions might he be making without appropriate oversight or disclosure? Implement. Enhanced monitoring across all Halstead-managed positions, I directed, and accelerate the governance implementation to today rather than waiting for tomorrow's scheduled delivery. Understood, Michael replied. And Olivia, I think it's time to consider a more direct intervention. This goes beyond the personal situation with your marriage. There could be significant fiduciary implications for the trust. I acknowledged his concern, recognizing that my compartmentalization of personal and professional considerations had perhaps allowed certain risks to develop unchecked. The wisdom of maintaining separation between my roles as James's wife and as trustee of the Calloway fortune, a separation I had justified as necessary and appropriate, now seemed increasingly questionable in light of emerging information. After ending the call, I sat in contemplative silence, my grandfather's teachings resonating with new significance. The true test of financial wisdom isn't how you respond to anticipated risks, but how quickly you recognize and adapt to the unexpected ones. The Meridian situation represented exactly such an unexpected risk, not just the financial exposure itself, but what it revealed about James's decision-making and his willingness to operate without transparent disclosure to his primary funding source. It suggested a level of hubris that went beyond simple marital dismissiveness into potential fiduciary irresponsibility. I accessed the trust's secure systems, reviewing our overall exposure to both Meridian Global and Halstead Partners. More broadly, the numbers confirmed Michael's assessment. While our direct exposure to Meridian was limited, our investment in Halstead represented a significant trust position. If James had indeed concentrated risk in ways that violated our governance expectations, the implications extended well beyond our personal relationship. When facts change, so must your approach, my grandfather would say. The worst financial disasters come from clinging to strategies after conditions have shifted. The conditions had indeed shifted, not just with James's dismissive characterization of me at the gala, but with this emerging evidence of potentially reckless financial management. The methodical, measured approach I had planned for revealing my true role in his success now needed acceleration and expansion to address these new concerns. I reached for my secure phone again, this time to call Esther Chen directly. Esther, it's Olivia. I need you to modify the governance implementation plan. We need to move more assertively given the Meridian situation. I've just been briefed. By Michael, she replied, her tone reflecting the seriousness of the situation. What specifically do you want to change? 2 things. First, I want direct trustee involvement in the review process, not just written documentation. Second, I want the initial meeting to happen tomorrow morning rather than next week. There was a brief pause as Esther considered the implications. You realize this will almost certainly force immediate disclosure of your role as principal. Trustee? There won't be time for the gradual revelation you had planned. I understand, I confirmed. But the trust's fiduciary responsibilities take precedence over personal considerations at this point. Another brief silence. Will you attend the meeting yourself? The question crystallized the choice before me, whether to maintain any separation between my dual identities or to fully integrate them in a single, definitive moment of revelation. Yes, I decided. Schedule it at the trust's offices. I'll conduct the meeting personally. As I ended the call, I found myself looking again at the lighthouse drawing on my study wall. My grandfather's last gift, reminding me what guides you home when seas are rough. Not emotional reaction or personal vindication, but the clear, unwavering principles that had guided Calloway decisions for generations. Responsibility over ego, substance over appearance, long-term stewardship over short-term advantage. The wisdom that had always been my true inheritance, more valuable than any financial assets the trust controlled. The understanding that wealth without purpose was merely accumulation, while wealth guided by principle could become a force for meaningful change. James had dismissed me as just a housewife, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I contributed to our shared life. But the appropriate response wasn't anger or retaliation. It was clarity, a clear demonstration of reality versus perception, a realignment of our relationship, personal and professional, with the actual distribution of capability and responsibility that had always existed beneath the convenient fiction we had maintained. My grandfather's voice seemed especially clear in that moment. True power isn't in what you control, Olivia, but in knowing when to use it. The time had come to use the power I had always held, not to break, but to rebuild on foundations of truth rather than convenient fiction. To finally allow Olivia Calloway to step fully into the light, no longer hidden behind the carefully constructed facade of James Halstead's wife. The transition between decision and action has always been my forte. In finance, that narrow window between recognizing an opportunity and executing a strategic position often determines success or failure. Too slow, and the moment passes. Too impulsive, and you miss critical variables. The discipline of measured, methodical preparation was something my grandfather had instilled in me from childhood, sitting beside me at his antique mahogany desk while reviewing quarterly reports from Calloway Holdings. "Anyone can react, Olivia," he would say, his silver fountain pen tapping thoughtfully against portfolio statements. "The art is in preparation, seeing 3 moves ahead while others are still processing the current state of play." That morning, after the call with Esther Chen, I moved with practiced efficiency. First, a secure call to Michael to coordinate our approach to the Meridian situation. Then, a detailed review of Halstead Partners' most recent trust disclosures, searching for additional risk factors that might have been obscured or downplayed. Finally, preparation of the documentation I would need for tomorrow's confrontation. Not just trust paperwork, but the personal evidence I had accumulated over 15 years of my dual existence. By 10 o'clock, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier in my private study. Financial statements showing the Calloway Trust's foundational investments in Halstead Partners, carefully channeled through various intermediary entities. Records of strategic client introductions facilitated through Calloway connections but credited to James's networking prowess. Documentation of investment strategies developed by Calloway analysts that had mysteriously found their way into Halstead's proprietary approaches. I organized everything methodically, creating both a chronological narrative and categorical groupings that demonstrated patterns rather than isolated incidents. This wasn't about constructing a case for prosecution, but rather preparing a clear, undeniable illustration of reality versus perception. The truth that James would need to confront, that his self-made success had been significantly engineered and supported by the very woman he had dismissed as just a housewife. My secure phone chimed with a message from Esther. "Meeting confirmed for 9 a.m. tomorrow at Calloway offices. James's assistant has been informed it's regarding urgent trust governance matters requiring his personal attention." I could imagine the confusion this would create at Halstead Partners. In 15 years, the trust had never demanded an emergency meeting with James personally. All communication had been carefully routed through intermediaries and standard reporting channels, maintaining the fiction that Calloway was simply one of many institutional investors in his firm rather than its foundational supporter. The next message came from Michael. "Security team briefed on situation. Additional protection arranged for Beacon Hill residents and your Commonwealth Avenue apartment." This precaution might seem excessive to an outsider, but it reflected the Calloway approach to significant transitions. Financial readjustments involving substantial assets could trigger unpredictable reactions. Better to anticipate potential volatility than be surprised by it. I confirmed receipt of both messages, then turned my attention to personal preparations. The Commonwealth Avenue apartment Michael had mentioned was my private residence, a property I had maintained since before my marriage, known only to family members and a few trusted associates. James had never questioned my desire to keep my grandmother's apartment in the family, assuming it was rented to long-term tenants rather than maintained as my personal sanctuary. The apartment would need to be prepared for my return. I sent a message to Helena, the housekeeper who maintained the property, requesting that she stock the kitchen and refresh the linens. I would likely move there directly after tomorrow's meeting, anticipating that the revelation of my true identity would render the Beacon Hill townhouse an untenable shared space. Next, I contacted my personal attorney, not Esther, who represented the trust's interests, but Margaret Dunham, who had handled my individual legal matters for years. I would need to initiate divorce proceedings immediately after the trust governance meeting, ensuring that personal and professional separations proceeded in coordinated fashion. "I'll prepare the necessary documentation," Margaret confirmed, after I outlined the situation. "Given the circumstances, I recommend we pursue an approach that clearly separates trust assets from marital property. This should be straightforward given the prenuptial agreement and your consistent maintenance of separate finances." The prenuptial agreement had been James's idea, ironically enough. Concerned about protecting his nascent business from potential claims, he had insisted on clear separation of assets acquired before and during the marriage. What he hadn't known was that I had quietly agreed to his terms because they actually provided stronger protection for the Callaway holdings than standard marital property laws would have allowed. By 11, I had addressed the most immediate logistical concerns and turned my attention to the emotional preparation necessary for tomorrow's confrontation. This would be the most challenging aspect, maintaining the calm, methodical approach that had defined my professional life while navigating what would certainly be a volatile personal encounter. I opened my laptop and accessed the private journal I had maintained throughout my marriage. Not a sentimental diary, but a precise record of key interactions, decisions, and observations. Entries documented the gradual shift in James's attitude toward me, from the early days when he had at least performatively valued my financial insights to the more recent years of reflexive dismissal and correction. May 15th, 2011. Dinner with Whitcomb clients. James interrupted my response to Keith's question about emerging markets to clarify my point, essentially restating exactly what I had already said. Third time this week. Pattern becoming more pronounced in group settings. February 8, 2013. Attempted to discuss concerns about Maxwell investment strategy. Jay cut conversation short, suggesting I was overthinking and should focus on charity, gala planning instead. 1 week later, Maxwell position collapsed as anticipated. Jay never acknowledged earlier discussion. October 30th, 2016. Jay presented my analysis of Indonesian manufacturing sector as his own research during client presentation. When I raised this privately later, he seemed genuinely confused, suggesting he couldn't remember where the insight had originated, but was sure he had developed it himself. April 22, 2019. Overheard Jay telling Richardson that my Black Ridge role had been something in HR or investor relations. She never talks about it. Deliberate diminishment or genuine misremembering. Increasingly difficult to distinguish. The entries continued, creating a clear pattern not of malicious intent, but of something perhaps more fundamentally concerning. James's complete inability to see me accurately. His perception of Olivia had gradually diverged from reality until it bore almost no resemblance to my actual capabilities, contributions, or identity. This wasn't just about his dismissive comment at the gala. That had merely crystallized a fundamental misalignment that had been developing for years. A fiction that I had allowed to persist for too long. At noon, Mrs. Winters appeared at my study door with a light lunch tray. "You've been working all morning," she observed, setting down a salad and sparkling water. "Important trust business?" "Yes," I replied simply. Mrs. Winters was more perceptive than most of our household staff, having managed our home for over a decade. She had undoubtedly noticed the careful compartmentalization of my life, the private study that remained locked when James was home, the calls I took only in certain rooms of the house, the visitors who came to see me when James was traveling. "Will you be joining Mr. Halstead for dinner with the Montgomerys tomorrow evening?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "No," I said. "There's been a change of plans. Mr. Halstead will need to make his apologies to them." Something in my voice must have communicated the significance of this statement. Mrs. Winters studied me briefly, then nodded with what might have been understanding. "I see. Will you be requiring anything special prepared for tomorrow?" "No, thank you. I'll be dining out tomorrow evening." Another nod, this one accompanied by the faintest smile. "Very good, ma'am." After she left, I returned to my preparations. The trust's formal notification to Halstead Partners had been delivered electronically at precisely noon, informing the firm of a significant governance review to begin immediately. By now, James's executive team would be scrambling to understand the implications while attempting to reach him in New York. My secure phone confirmed this assessment, lighting up with a message from Michael. First response received from Halstead. CFO, requesting clarification and extension, standard delaying tactics. I wasn't surprised. Halstead's chief financial officer, Thomas Reed, was skilled at managing institutional investors' concerns with reassuring language and minimal substantive disclosure. It was a strategy that had served the firm well in maintaining the appearance of transparency while actually revealing very little about their operations. "No extensions," I replied to Michael. "Proceed as scheduled." By mid-afternoon, I had completed most of the technical preparations for tomorrow's meeting. The Trust's research team had assembled a comprehensive analysis of Halstead's exposure to Meridian Global, including transaction records that appeared to confirm the concerns Michael had raised earlier. If accurate, these findings suggested James had deliberately obscured significant risk concentration from the Trust's regular oversight, a serious breach of both professional ethics and fiduciary responsibility. This development added another dimension to tomorrow's confrontation. What had begun as a personal reckoning, addressing James's fundamental misperception of my identity and contribution, had evolved to include potential financial misconduct that could impact the Trust's broader interests. I spent the next hour reviewing the Meridian documentation carefully, identifying key questions that would need to be addressed. The pattern of transactions suggested not just poor risk management, but potentially deliberate concealment, using structured products and derivative positions to build exposure that wouldn't be immediately visible on standard reporting. If James had indeed authorized this approach, it represented a concerning departure from the investment philosophy he had espoused throughout his career. His public persona was built around careful risk management and transparent client relationships. Concealing significant exposure from his primary institutional investor contradicted those stated principles fundamentally. At 4 o'clock, my private line rang, this time showing James's number. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided that maintaining normalcy until tomorrow's confrontation was the more strategic approach. "Hello, James," I answered, my voice carrying its usual composed warmth. "Liv, what the hell is happening?" His tone was sharp with barely contained agitation. "I'm getting urgent messages from Reed about some kind of emergency trust review. The Callaway Trust is suddenly demanding immediate access to our positions and threatening to suspend funding. This has to be a mistake." I noted with detached interest that he had abandoned his meetings, whether business or personal, to address this situation. The first sign that he recognized the potential threat to his carefully constructed professional identity. "I wouldn't." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm not involved with your business operations." "That's exactly my point," he said, exasperation evident. "This is clearly some kind of administrative error. Can you call your cousin Michael? He's on the Trust's board, isn't he? Ask him what's going on." The assumption that my relationship with the Callaway Trust was limited to a casual family connection had been another fiction I had allowed to persist. One that now served my strategic purposes as James floundered for an explanation. "I'm afraid I can't help with this, James. It sounds like a formal business matter between Halstead Partners and the Callaway Trust. I'm sure your CFO can handle it appropriately. Liv, you don't understand. The trust provides significant funding for our operations. If they suspend the quarterly distribution, it creates serious cash flow issues. This isn't just some routine inquiry. The edge of panic in his voice confirmed what I had long suspected. Despite his careful cultivation of multiple funding sources and clients, James remained fundamentally dependent on the Callaway capital he believed came with no strings attached. I see, I said. Well, from what you're describing, it sounds like they're requesting a meeting to discuss concerns. Perhaps the best approach is to attend the meeting and address their questions directly. I'm scheduled to be in New York through tomorrow evening, he protested. These meetings have been on the calendar for months. It seems you have a choice to make then, I observed. Which is more important, your New York meetings or responding to concerns from your largest investor? The silence that followed suggested James was not accustomed to this kind of straightforward challenge from me, another indication of how completely he had come to believe in the fictional version of his wife he had constructed. I'll have to rearrange things, he finally said, his tone suggesting this was an unreasonable imposition. Can you at least reach out to Michael, find out what this is really about? Maybe get them to postpone until next week? I'm afraid I have commitments tomorrow that can't be rescheduled, I replied. But I'm sure if you attend their meeting and address their concerns transparently, you'll resolve the situation quickly. Another silence, this one tinged with confusion. He had expected immediate accommodation. His wife dropping everything to help smooth over this inconvenient disruption to his plans. Fine, he said tersely. I'll fly back tonight, but when this gets resolved, I'm going to have a serious conversation with the trust about appropriate communication protocols. This kind of ambush is completely unprofessional. I'm sure you'll handle it appropriately, I said. Safe travels. After ending the call, I forwarded a brief summary to Michael and Esther, alerting them that James would likely attempt to contact other trust representatives before tomorrow's meeting. His instinct would be to identify allies who might provide insight or advantage to reestablish control over a situation that had unexpectedly slipped beyond his management. By 5 o'clock, I had completed my professional preparations and turned to more personal considerations. I needed to select appropriate attire for tomorrow's confrontation, clothing that would visually reinforce the transition from Olivia Halstead, corporate wife, to Olivia Callaway, principal trustee. In my dressing room, I bypassed the section of my wardrobe that contained the feminine, decorative pieces James preferred. The colorful dresses and softly tailored suits that reinforced his perception of me as an ornamental asset. Instead, I selected a precisely tailored Acris pantsuit in charcoal gray, a garment I normally reserved for private Callaway board meetings when James was traveling. With it, I chose my grandmother's pearl necklace. Not the delicate strand James had seen me wear to social functions, but the substantial, graduated South Sea pearls that had been passed down through generations of Callaway women. A subtle symbol of lineage and continuity that would carry personal significance without ostentatious display. These choices weren't about creating dramatic effect, but about authentic representation. Tomorrow, I would appear as myself, not as the carefully curated version of wife that James had constructed and I had allowed to persist. By 6, I had packed an overnight bag with essentials I would take to the Commonwealth Avenue apartment after the meeting. Nothing excessive or dramatic, just the items I would need for the immediate transition. The rest could be dealt with later, after the initial confrontation had established new parameters for our interactions. My secure phone chimed with a final update from Michael. Security confirms JH booking return flight tonight. Arriving Boston 11:40 p.m. Car service arranged. To Beacon Hill residence. All systems in place for 9 a.m. meeting. I acknowledged the message, then moved to the final phase of my preparation. Not the logistical or strategic elements, but the personal centering necessary before significant confrontation. In the quiet, Of my private study, I opened the small Japanese box my grandfather had given me when I assumed leadership of the trust. Inside was a simple object, a smooth stone from the Maine shoreline where Callaways had summered for generations. When facing difficult decisions, he had told me, hold something that reminds you who you are and where you come from. Not your title or position, but the values that remain when all external markers are stripped away. I held the stone in my palm, feeling its cool weight and the subtle textures that decades of tidal forces had polished to silken smoothness. This moment had been years in the making, the inevitable collision between fiction and reality, between the compartmentalized identities I had maintained and the integrated self that had always existed beneath the surface. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, revelation, and undoubtedly, James's shocked disbelief. But it would also bring something I had sacrificed for too long, the alignment of my public and private selves, the integration of the professional capabilities and personal identity I had kept carefully separated within my marriage. The preparation was complete. Not just the documentation and logistics, but the internal readiness to move beyond the fiction we had maintained for 15 years, to allow James to finally see, truly see, the woman he had married, rather than the convenient construction he had created in his mind. Outside my study window, Boston's financial district glittered in the early evening light, the towers where tomorrow's confrontation would unfold, and where, for the first time in 15 years, Olivia Callaway would fully emerge from the shadows. Of Olivia Halstead. The morning dawned clear and cold, a crystalline January day that painted Boston in sharp relief. From my third-floor study, I watched the first rays of sunlight illuminate the gold dome of the State House, its gleam a beacon against the clear blue sky. The city felt unusually still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I had slept surprisingly well. Not the restless anxiety I might have expected before such a significant confrontation, but the deep restorative sleep that comes with absolute certainty. The decision had been made, the preparations completed. Now remained only the execution, the methodical implementation of a plan that would irrevocably transform my marriage and professional identity. James had returned late the previous night, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he made his way to the guest bedroom, rather than disturbing me. An unusual courtesy that suggested his agitation about today's meeting had overridden his typical self-absorption. I had heard him on the phone well past midnight, his voice a low, urgent murmur as he presumably sought insights from colleagues about the trust's sudden scrutiny. As I dressed in the charcoal acris suit I had selected, I reviewed the morning's timeline once more. My driver would arrive at 8:15, allowing me to reach the Callaway Trust offices well before James's scheduled 9 a.m. meeting. I would be seated in the chairman's position at the head of the conference table when he arrived, a physical embodiment of the revelation to come. My secure phone chimed with a message from Michael. All arrangements confirmed. Executive team assembled. JH has requested preliminary meeting with Trust Council, denied as per protocol. I acknowledged the update, noting with detached interest that James was already attempting to navigate around the formal structure of the meeting, seeking the advantage of private conversation before the official confrontation. It was a typical strategy for him, one that had served him well in business negotiations throughout his career. Identify the decision-makers, charm them individually, then enter formal discussions with alliances already established. But the Callaway Trust operated differently. Decisions emerged from collective deliberation, guided by established principles, not from personal influence or charismatic persuasion. James was about to discover the limitations of tactics that might work with individual investors, but foundered against institutional governance. At precisely 7:45, I heard James moving about the house, his footsteps quickening as morning routines gave way to preparation for what he clearly perceived as a threatening business situation. I remained in my study, deliberately avoiding what would have been our typical morning interaction. my appearance in the kitchen to ensure his breakfast was properly prepared, his coffee exactly as he preferred it. The silence from my usual domestic orbit must have registered, as his footsteps eventually approached my study door, a threshold he rarely crossed. "Olivia?" His knock was uncharacteristically tentative. "Are you in there?" I opened the door, noting his momentary surprise at finding me already dressed in formal business attire rather than the silk robe or casual clothes he would have expected at this hour. "Good morning, James." My voice carried the same pleasant neutrality I had maintained throughout our marriage. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in my appearance. "You're dressed early. I thought you had that hospital committee meeting this afternoon." "My schedule changed," I replied simply. He hesitated, clearly trying to reconcile my unexpected presentation with his mental model of our typical interactions. "I'm heading into a difficult meeting with Callaway representatives. Did you have any luck reaching Michael yesterday?" "I didn't try," I said. "As I mentioned, this seems like a matter between Halstead Partners and the trust." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly, frustration at what he perceived as a lack of wifely support during a professional challenge. "This is serious, Olivia. The trust is threatening to suspend our quarterly distribution without explanation. That impacts our household as much as my business." I noted with interest his automatic conflation of Halstead Partners' financial health with our personal finances. Another fiction he had maintained despite the careful separation of accounts I had established from the beginning of our marriage. "I'm sure you'll handle it appropriately," I said, gathering my portfolio and handbag. "I need to leave shortly. I have an early meeting downtown." "Downtown?" His confusion was evident. My daily routine rarely took me into Boston's financial district before mid-morning, if at all. "What meeting?" "A professional obligation," I replied, the deliberate vagueness a final maintenance of the compartmentalization that would end within hours. James's frustration visibly mounted. He was unaccustomed to anything but complete information about my schedule and activities, not because he tracked me controlling, but because my movements had always been arranged around his needs and expectations. "Olivia, what's going on? You're acting strangely, and I'm dealing with a potential financial crisis at the firm. I need your support right now, not mysterious errands downtown." I met his gaze directly. "I understand you're facing a challenging situation, James. I suggest you focus your attention on preparing for your meeting with the Callaway Trust. It appears to require your full professional attention." Before he could respond, my phone chimed softly, the alert that my driver had arrived. I moved past him toward the stairs, conscious of his momentary speechlessness at what must have seemed an unprecedented departure from my usual accommodating response to his concerns. "I'll see you later, James," I said, not turning back as I descended the stairs to the entryway where Mrs. Winters waited with my coat. "Your car is here, Mrs. Halstead," she said, helping me into the wool coat I reserved for official Callaway business, rather than the fashionable pieces James preferred me to wear for social visibility. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters." I paused, acknowledging the significance of what might be my final departure from this house as Olivia Halstead. "I may be late returning this evening. Please don't wait up." Something in her expression suggested she understood more than her position would indicate. "Very good, ma'am. Good luck with your meeting." Outside, the Callaway Trust's discreet black Audi waited at the curb, driver standing at attention beside the rear door. Not the ostentatious luxury vehicles James preferred for client meetings, but the understated elegance that had characterized Callaway operations for generations. As we pulled away from the Beacon Hill townhouse, I glanced back once at the carefully restored federal architecture that had housed my compartmentalized existence for 15 years. By the end of today, that careful separation would dissolve entirely, the parallel lives I had maintained merging into a single, integrated identity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.